the Africans saw that they had guns and some other goods that they wanted, and they didn't really have much to trade. So what did they trade? They traded other people. They traded the members of their rivaling tribes, and sometimes even people from their own tribes.
These were some of the major areas and major African kingdoms and whatnot that sold, African slaves, and had long before the Portuguese as the first quote-unquote Europeans to show up in Africa and begin slave trading. Slavery existed long before the European or white man came.
Education will get rid of a lot of racism in America. Another thing that white people love to say about slavery is that Africans sold Africans into slavery. And that doesn't stand up to the light of truth. Basically, slavery in the world, the world had never seen slavery that America had, which is called chattel slavery. Yeah, so chattel slavery in America was the very first of its kind. Nothing in the history of the world had ever seen slavery to this magnitude. One race enslaving another race had never taken place. So what it was a lot of people came to America as indentured servants. Well, you serve 7 years and then you're released. You could work off your debt. But what happened in America, chattel slavery, it was no way possible for you to ever be free. Your children were born into slavery and they would die in slavery. You were in slavery and you would die in slavery. So there was no such thing as working off a debt. So a lot of people that say we sold ourselves into slavery, that's not true, because we didn't know the form of slavery that took place in America. There should be another word for it. So once again, that's a lie, a myth that white people love to say, that Africans sold themselves into slavery, because slavery of that form never existed. What was in Africa was serfdom. Serfdom would be like somebody that works and they have to give a certain portion of their income to somebody in a higher class, as if a slave works for free and they have to give everything, their property. So chattel slavery and African slavery is two different things. So no Africans didn't sell themselves into slavery. That form of slavery didn't even exist. They didn't know what they were giving their people into. When they found out, they ceased. During slavery, that was the most documented time in history, one of the most documented times in history. And inside of those documents, we can find no record of any African people mass slave raiding or whatever. They don't have that except for one person. His name was Tipu Tip. And Tipu Tip, his mother was African, but his dad was a pale Arab or a white Arab. And he came out as a mulatto, so he wasn't really, you can't really say he was African like that. He was, his dad was white. And he is accounted for selling a whole lot of Africans into slavery, but they have no other name, no other people, no other tribe that they can just pinpoint and say that they sold a lot of black people into slavery. So that's a made up propaganda so that white people can feel less guilt, less shame for the atrocities that they have. So education would be the key to a lot of these things that white people say about slavery. The more educated they are, the less excuses that they have for the atrocities of slavery. Yeah. So another thing I wanted to clarify and make clear was that if a white person captured me, had me as a slave, and as a part of me being a slave, he forced me to catch other black people. White people oftentimes said that we helped catch each other, but it wasn't like voluntary catching and I got paid for catching other slaves. It was a forced slave being forced to catch other slaves. You saw that on movies, I think on that movie Mandingo. Yeah, oftentimes African slave would help catch other African slaves, but that doesn't mean that Africans sold each other into slavery, because slavery was a demand-driven market, which means that people acquired slaves because slaves were wanted. Who wanted slaves? White people wanted slaves because of the New World being discovered and back in Europe. And Europe wanted slaves, the New World wanted slaves, so they sent people to get slaves. So Africans selling themselves into slavery had shit to do with the slave trade. It had nothing to do with, basically, education is the key. You have to learn this stuff. Don't just take their word for it, anybody's word. History classes oftentimes get it wrong. It's a good book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. What it is like I said, white guilt is so strong that they come up with different things as to why they shouldn't be or feel as guilty as they do. And oftentimes black people regurgitate the things they've been told by white people. Myth historians, I say again. In slavery, Africans selling each other into slavery is one of those myths. So instead of you taking their word for it, go out there and research this. You gotta understand the descendants of the people that put us in slavery are the ones that's telling you about slavery. So you can't use their logic or his story for validation. You have to go out there and research and learn for yourself. I know I'm gonna misquote it, but it's an African saying that until lions write their history, the history always be told from the perspective of the hunter. So basically, whoever wins or whoever has the power are the ones that write history, and oftentimes that history is misrepresented and not accurately portrayed.